Hey everyone, today we're ranking every content release for Dead by Daylight, covering the chapters and paragraphs. I did cover this previously, but that video is almost a year old now. We've had a bunch more content added, and much of what I said in that video, I don't entirely agree with anymore. So let's get into it. This time round I also want to add some tiers, to give a bit of a structure between the chapters. These tiers being weak chapters, average chapters, good chapters, great chapters, and near perfect chapters. Starting out with the weak chapters. Paragraph 2, Leatherface, is still the worst to me. This paragraph contained only Leatherface content-wise. Bubba is probably one of my least favourite killers in the game, and I find his power incredibly dull, even after its rework. He has been improved over time with updates, but that whole content release is one I've never really been a fan of. Paragraph 3, Ash vs Evil Dead, is next up, and a content release that I thought had a lot of heart behind it, even if the whole thing was fairly weak. It was cool to see Ash in game, and for him to be voiced by Bruce Campbell, but with Ash's weak perk set, and the general lack of content this paragraph provided, this was one of the weaker ones for sure. The lore is pretty fun at least. Next up we have the average chapters. Starting off here we have chapter 21.5, Hour of the Witch. This is a chapter that only had Michaela Reed in it, a survivor character with a new perk type, Boons. Michaela's main benefit was that she brought boons, boons being one of the most interesting new perk types to be brought to the game, and a type that genuinely shook up the meta too. She has fun lore, and her design is pretty cool too. Paragraph 1, Left Behind, was a paragraph that solely included Bill Overbeck from Left 4 Dead. It also had additional costumes added for the original 4 characters that were made to look like the other Left 4 Dead characters. Bill has really become a fan favourite in DBD, and brought along a bunch of good perks. A small content release, but an impactful one. Chapter 6, A Nightmare on Elm Street, is our first full chapter here. This chapter just had so many issues, to be honest, both with the content itself, but also apparently with the license too, behind the scenes. The Nightmare feels like a poor representation of Freddy Krueger, particularly with his power feeling extremely underwhelming for how expansive and creative his power could have been. Quentin had a lot of facial issues early on, and I think generally he was just brought in poorly, with his perks further being lackluster. The map Springwood is one of my least favourite maps in the game, but does have a decent resemblance to the films. Chapter 22, Portrait of a Murder, is a chapter that was just really This chapter featured the artist, Jone Vasquez, and a new map. Area of Crows looks amazing, but the gameplay is horrible, and the map is far too big. The artist was a decent addition. She has a cool visual design, but her power is pretty dull. Jonah was a very average addition to the roster. He didn't really bring along very interesting perks, and he doesn't seem to have garnered much of a player base either. Chapter 3 of Flesh and Mud is a chapter that featured the Hag, Ace, and the Swamp. I like Ace quite a bit, and his whole vibe. I like his distinctness from the other survivors. Hag's backstory with the hexes is also interesting, just a shame it wasn't expanded on really. There's good intrigue though. Her power is something I don't really enjoy, and is largely miserable to face. The swamp maps are also probably some of my least favourite, although they are marginally redeemed by having quite a spooky ambience. Chapter 8, Curtain Call, is next up. This chapter introduced the Clown, Kate Denson, and the map, Father Campbell's Chapel. This whole chapter I felt was just extremely average. The Clown is one of the least interesting killers to me, and is one of my least favourite to face. Kate was a good addition, and definitely popular with the player base, but I still find her look and design to be fairly generic. I do like her backstory though. If Father Campbell's Chapel had remained as it was prior to its changes, this chapter would probably be higher. But unfortunately the map has kind of taken a hit since its changes, and additions of breakable walls. Chapter 1, The Last Breath, introduced the Nurse, Nia Carlson, and Crotus Pren Asylum. Crotus Pren is probably my least favourite part of this chapter, being a map with great ambience but little balance. The Nurse is a game-changing character, but also quite a controversial one. She's personally not a character I enjoy playing or facing, but I realise she does have an important place in the game nonetheless. Nia is definitely a good character, and greatly loved by the player base, but I find both her perks and lore as somewhat boring. Chapter 18, A Binding of Kin, brought along both the twins and Elodie Rakoto. I think the main strength of this chapter is that everything in it is really well done. The release was rough, but the content itself is good. Twins are very unique, and they provide distinctive gameplay. Elodie has some great perks and really interesting lore. The main downside of this chapter is its lack of map, but I think that is pretty passable with both characters being really solid. Chapter 12, Ghostface, is a chapter that featured solely the Ghostface. A small chapter, but a really good one I feel. Ghostface is widely loved, he has a fun power and general vibe. His backstory is cool, and he's fun to both play and face in game. Overall, probably one of the better stealth killers. Further, a great combination of both licensed and original content. Chapter 19, All Kill, overall as a chapter was very visually distinct. It brought in two quite well loved characters with both the Trickster and Jone. Again, this was one of the most visually distinctive chapters. It's honestly a shame that we didn't end up getting a map. The Trickster's power is one I personally don't like, but he does seem to have quite a high pick rate, and is generally loved by the community. Jone is a character I like a lot, particularly with her lore placing her in more of a grey morality. Overall, an interesting chapter. Chapter 21, Hellraiser, is our final chapter here. This chapter also solely featured a killer, the Cenobite. The Cenobite is incredibly detailed, really faithful, and just has a generally cool presence in game. I personally really enjoy both using and facing his power too. The main downside of this chapter is the lack of content, but the little content we did get is really good. Okay, on to the good chapters. Starting off, we have Chapter 9, Shattered Bloodline. This chapter has never really been my favourite. However, the entire vibe and look of the chapter is something I really enjoy. The Yamaoka estate is a great map and realm, and has a bunch of interesting detail. It's also just got a really distinct visual look. Adam is a good addition to the survivor roster, bringing along some interesting perks. The Spirit, although controversial, has probably one of the cooler visual designs in the game. Next up, we have Chapter 24, Roots of Dread. This is a chapter that features the Dredge, Hadi Core, and the map Garden of Joy. I really like the map personally, and think it's got this great look to it. It's also one of the creepier maps, I would say. Hadi is a great new character, being set up for a while in the lore. Then the Dredge is a fairly interesting killer, with a very cool visual design, and a strange but intriguing power. Chapter 23, Sadako Rising, was a chapter that I really enjoyed, and mainly for the chapter's return back to horror. This chapter really felt like it was meant to be scary. Sadako is the main positive of this chapter, having an awesome design, and a power that I really like to use. She's a little underpowered maybe, but she's fun nonetheless. Yoichi is a good addition to the survivor roster, and brought along some interesting perks. Chapter 17, Descend Beyond, was a chapter that upon release felt fairly lackluster, maybe even a bit boring. However, the Blight has really solidified his place into the killer roster, and became a real favourite for many people, having quite a high skill ceiling and learning curve to his power. Felix is cool too, and has a good backstory. I'm personally a big fan of his perks also. Chapter 10, Darkness Among Us, is probably going to be a little controversial being so high up. This chapter featured the Legion, Jeff Johansson, and the map Ormond. Ormond is a very unique map visually, and is probably one of my favourite environments to move around in. Jeff was a good addition, a nice wholesome survivor with a cool design. Then we have the Legion, who are very unique as killers, as they're technically four. They have a fairly interesting power, with a cool backstory that incorporates all the members. Chapter 20, Resident Evil, is a chapter that upon initial release I was really excited about. However, there is a lot that kind of feels off about it. Nemesis as a character doesn't quite feel as impactful as he maybe should, with his power feeling unfitting for the character. His visuals and sound design though are really amazing. Both Leon and Jill were introduced very well, and have a bunch of fun perks to play around with. The RPD is too big, but I do love the detail and in general the differentiation in setting that the map brings. Okay, on to the great chapters. Chapter 5, A Lullaby for the Dark, is a chapter that featured the Huntress, David, and the Mother's Dwelling map. Great chapter overall, both Huntress and David becoming greatly loved by the community. Mother's Dwelling is also a personal favourite map of mine. I really love the cozy vibe it brings. Huntress was implemented really well as the first ranged killer, and David brought along a variation of overpowered and fun perks. Chapter 4, Spark of Madness, is a chapter that brought Feng, the Doctor, and Larry's Memorial Institute. Again, another one of my personal favourite maps. I love the atmosphere of Larry's, and it's one of the few indoor maps I think is pretty bearable. Feng was a great addition and has become widely loved. She has probably the most well-rounded perks, and easily the most cosmetics. Doctor is a great starter character, and one that's easy enough to learn, but does still have a level of skill the more technical you get with him. Chapter 7, Saw, is probably one of the better done licenses. I really loved how they introduced Tap, with small details retaining like the scar on his neck. He also brought a set of well-rounded perks. Pig is a really fun, multifaceted killer who can use traps, stealth, and special speed attacks. She has a really interesting kit overall. The map The Game has a bunch of cool details, not the fairest, but it does have a unique layout that makes it stand apart. Chapter 2, Halloween, is probably the best unlicensed chapter, purely in terms of immersion. Playing as the Shape really feels like you're playing as Michael Myers. His stealth-based power and stalk-up system really playing into this. Laurie is also a good addition, with her perks feeling particularly accurate to her film experiences. After Haddonfield's update, it's also far more bearable, and generally just a more pleasant looking map, with an interesting layout. Chapter 11, Demise of the Faithful, was one of the best original chapters. I largely love this chapter for the map, weirdly. Temple of Purgation is my favourite map in the game, despite being so large. Plague is also one of the fairest characters. There's a lot to learn with her power, but learning her is also manageable and rewarding. Finally we have Jane. Jane has an interesting backstory, and also brought in some fun new perks, Head-On being one of my favourites. Finally, let's talk about the near perfect chapters. Chapter 15, Chains of Hate, is going to start us off. This chapter all round is so good. Deathslinger is an awesome addition with a fun power and a great visual design. Zarina is one of the more compelling survivors with an interesting backstory and also a very unique set of perks. Finally, Dead Dog is just awesome. I love this map and there was clearly a lot of love put into it. Chapter 14, Curse Legacy, is next up, and my personal favourite original chapter. Basically the only weakness of this chapter is the map, Sanctum of Wrath. Even that has some fun aspects to it, and an interesting visual look and layout. Oni is my favourite original character with a solid backstory, and amazing in-game visuals. He also has one of the fairest and most fun powers to face and use. Yui is also an awesome character, she has a great backstory, and her whole visual look is very distinct and fitting for that backstory. Both of these characters have decent perks. Chapter 13, Stranger Things, is probably the most influential chapter the game has seen. It's one of those chapters that has to be recognised as a positive influence on the game. It brought along the most balanced killer, the Demogorgon. Further two survivors, Nancy and Steve, who both look very faithful to their show counterparts. Despite Hawkins no longer being in the game, it was a very unique map and was well loved by many. Despite it leaving the game, this chapter is undeniably one of the best we've had. To me, the best chapter to this day still remains as Chapter 16, Silent Hill. This chapter was the closest thing to a perfect chapter. The executioner was introduced amazingly, his power being interesting and having a lot to it, his only letdown being his perk set. Cheryl was a great addition, and visually very faithful. Her perks are some of the most interesting and fun for survivors too. The map of Midwich is one of the best maps for ambience, and is quite a fun map to play on, I find. Basically, the only complaint I have for this chapter is the perks, which are pretty awful for Pyramid Head in particular. This isn't that big a deal though. Alright, well, that's gonna do it. I do hope you enjoyed, and be sure to drop your own rankings down below. Thanks, and goodbye.